Hello, today I want to explain top 9 reasons for why Hitler lost World War II. I agree with the historians that claim that, uh, in a way, his defeat was over-determined. So sometimes people will say, had Nazis won the Battle of Moscow, they would have won the war. Or had they attacked earlier without the Yugoslavia doing a military coup against the Germans, that's exactly the time they needed to conquer Moscow. But I claim, like many other historians, nothing would have changed. Nothing like that would have essentially changed the outcome of the war. So let us just look at this map. Red is the territory controlled by Hitler and by the fascist allies, and blue is the anti-fascist coalition. So just looking at this map, it becomes obvious to us that the allies, the anti-fascist coalition, had more men, more resources, more oil, and oil was, um, by many historians, deemed as the #1 factor for Hitler losing the war. A lack of oil, to be more precise. While the Soviets had a lot of oil in the Caucasus and in Iran, so Stalin and Churchill actually attacked Iranian oil fields. That's not often discussed. They just nonchalantly attacked uh, Iran and took the oil. But okay, so while Stalin and Churchill had an abundance of oil, Hitler was lacking in oil, especially as the war went on, and he pretty much had only the Romanian oil fields, and he was trying to steal Soviet oil, but he was unsuccessful in his attempts. And so this map also tells us that the Soviets produced way more weapons. Let's just look at the tanks. So the Soviet Union in 1941 had somewhere around 20,000 tanks. Some estimates even say 22,000 tanks. The Germans, on the other hand, in 1941 had 3,000 tanks. And in 1941, they were probably at its peak when it comes to the number of tanks. But what's also difficult to measure is the fact that Germans captured many of the Soviet tanks because the Red Army was very inefficient. In 1941, they simply didn't know how to respond to the Blitzkrieg. But on the other hand, as Hitler was capturing Soviet tanks, he was also losing tanks. So, and Stalin was producing new tanks. So it's not obvious that the Germans had a better ratio or a larger number of tanks later on during the war, especially when the Western Front opened. Hitler had to mobilize some tanks and send them to Africa and later to Italy, to France. So he was probably, at least when it comes to tanks, in a best situation in 1941, and we can see that even then it doesn't look good for Hitler. Not to mention that T-34 tanks were actually very good, and the Germans were even surprised that quote-unquote inferior races could produce such a tank. So Soviet engineers were actually quite good, and they even, some would say, outsmarted German engineers when it comes to tank production. So T-34, it was a cheaper tank than what the Germans had. Primarily, I'm talking about the Tiger tanks. It was cheaper to produce, faster to produce, and pretty much equally good. Um, at least when it comes to what the Soviets actually needed at the time. So, okay, population is also an important factor. So, some historians overestimate the importance of population and they'll say, the Germans lost just because they were outnumbered. Well, no, there are many other reasons. But population definitely was a factor. So the population of Germany and its European allies was somewhere around 150 million, while the Soviet population in 1941, just the Soviet population was 195 million. So again, it doesn't look good for Germany. And okay, it is true that many Soviet citizens actually joined the Wehrmacht, like the Balkars, Chechens, the Ukrainians, but what also needs to be said is that, okay, there was a Western front later on, but other than that, uh, there were many strong resistant movements on Nazi-occupied territory, like in Yugoslavia and Greece, and even the French resistance that wasn't that strong caused a lot of trouble to the Germans, especially before D-Day. So when you take into account all the resistant movements of Europe, the situation looks even worse for the Germans when we compare them to the Soviets. Yeah, the number of deaths also tells us something. So the Soviets could actually afford to lose 20 million men. Some estimates even say 30 million men. And because of it, their kind of crazy tactic of just relentless attack that was well actually started by Stalin in 1942. It actually worked. And if you look at the history of Russian war, it kind of seems that just throwing bodies at the problem often works. And while the Soviets did lose more men, well, they also intimidated the Germans with their determination and their crazy enthusiasm in just relentlessly attacking them. And they definitely slowed the German invasion and caused them to lose oil supplies and men. And yeah, I would argue the tactic actually did work. Um, but okay, yeah, they lost a lot of men. And one of the most important reasons is the fact that the Soviet economy was actually more resilient than what the Nazis imagined. So here on this map we can see that the Soviets very quickly were able to mobilize their factories and population towards the east. And because of it, the Germans weren't able to steal as much Soviet resources as they wanted. Not to mention the fact that the agriculture was collectivized, made it much easier for Stalin to mobilize grain eastwards, and in that way he saved food and saved it for his people and prevented the Germans from taking the grain. So the fact that the Soviet Union was totalitarian um, and the fact that Stalin had a very tight grip on the economy, according to Isaac Deutscher, was actually useful at the time. And because of it, the Soviets were very good at mobilizing their population and factories and resources towards the east, and and they harmed the German army by mobilizing that quickly, and also actually confused them. The Germans were in awe when they realized that the Soviets collectivized their land. They didn't even realize how the Soviet economy looked before they attacked the Soviet Union, and that's probably why they didn't expect it to survive and to be so resilient after the German attack. And what also needs to be said is that Zhukov was actually a military genius, and despite the fact that Stalin killed some of his best generals, Zhukov was the hero that the Soviets needed at the time, and he was, well, probably he was actually better than Tukhachevsky that was killed in the Great Purges. And Zhukov actually realized that he can use Hitler's tactics against him. And in the same way that Romans defeated the Carthaginians at the Battle of Zama by using their tactics against them, Zhukov actually formed a Soviet strategy that imitated the Blitzkrieg. It was called Maskirovka. So the point of the tactic was to deceive your enemy, to make him think you will attack him on one place and then attack him with all you got on another place. And it is similar to Blitzkrieg because Zhukov primarily used tanks to break the enemy lines, and then instead of encircling the Germans, he would just continue to go forward and create panic and chaos behind enemy lines. And that technique was actually very successful. And Zhukov was brilliant when it came to deceiving the German military. He managed to attack them always where and when they least expected it. And yeah, the weather conditions were also important, but they definitely weren't the most important reason. So some people will tell you that the Germans lost because it was cold during the winter in the Soviet Union, but um, they didn't lose just because of it. And what is bizarre is that the coldest winter of the 20th century was actually in 1941, and because of it, Roosevelt joked and said that God is on the side of the Soviets. And the cold was a problem. Not just because some Germans froze to death or because they got sick, but because the gasoline inside the tanks froze and stopped the advance. But before winter kicked in, the mud season was the problem for the Germans. Rasputitsa, as it is called. So it can be translated as a sea of mud or as roadlessness. And here we can see the German army getting stuck in the mud, and here we can see Russian tanks being stuck in the mud in Ukraine in this recent war. And it is kind of ironical that the same obstacle that once helped Russians is now harming them. But then again, that's what happens when you attack another country, especially Ukraine, during the spring. It just happens in springtime in Ukraine. So the Russians shouldn't be that surprised that their tanks get stuck in the mud. And some historians even argue that the same thing way before it happened to Hitler, it happened to the Mongols in the Middle Ages when they invaded the medieval territory uh, of what is Ukraine today. And yeah, we've reached one of the most bizarre things done by Hitler in World War II, declaration of war on the United States. Now, what's bizarre about it is that Hitler Hitler didn't have to do it. He just didn't have to do it, and he was probably angered by the fact that Roosevelt was helping the Soviets. Hitler famously said that he was sick and tired of seeing his submarines being inactive. So maybe that's why. Maybe that's why he did it. Uh, yeah, we don't know. I mean, many of his generals advised him not to do it, but he was convinced that that's necessary. Maybe he hoped that Japan is going to declare the war on the Soviets if he declares the war on the United States, but that didn't happen, as we know. Um, the enigma. So Churchill famously said that Turing is um, the man most single-handedly responsible for the Allies winning the war. And Turing was definitely one of the people responsible for the fact that Enigma was decoded. And yeah, that really did help the anti-fascist war effort. The Soviets were given information about the German attack at Kursk, which is why they won that huge battle. It was the largest tank battle in the history of humanity. But what's tragic about Turing, he was killed. Actually, not killed. He was chemically castrated by the British state for the crime of having gay sex after the war, and that probably led to him killing himself a year after that happened. And Heisenberg. So the guy Walter White is named. So Walter White is actually, he names himself as an homage to the original Heisenberg. Heisenberg is the German equivalent of Einstein, but according to some historians, he actually managed to convince Hitler not to produce nuclear weapons. He told him it is too difficult to produce it and asked him instead to work on the nuclear submarine engines. And he didn't want Hitler to have so much power, but on the other hand, he didn't want to leave his country during the war, which is quite interesting. So, the one hand, he was a German patriot and one might say a nationalist, but he still disliked Hitler and he didn't want to give him that weapon. And if that's true, if the theory is true, then he is the unsung hero of World War II because he could have used his genius to invent the nuclear weapons for the Nazis, but he refused to do it. He is the guy that realized that you can't know where the electron is and where the electron is going to be at the same time, something like that. And finally, Gavrilo Popov argues that fascism, because of its racism, simply had to fail, and it forced some nations like the Ukrainians and Chechens not to fight for Hitler in large numbers. And while communism was more attractive to rest of the world than fascism.